Every week for 8 years, someone paid to keep her alive, and she never knew his name. Evelyn Harper built her whole life around flowers and silence and the quiet belief that good things could survive in hard places. She raised her son alone. She worked before dawn. She smiled at strangers who bought lilies for women they were probably lying to. And every single week, without fail, a cash payment arrived for an order she never remembered placing. White lilies, blue hydrangeas, no name, no number, no explanation. Just money, just flowers, just enough to keep the lights on one more week. She thought it was luck. It wasn't luck. It was a man who had spent 8 years believing she was dead, and the flowers were the only way he knew how to grieve. If you've made it this far, stay with me. Hit that like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all started to fall apart. The alarm went off at 4:15 and Evelyn was already awake. She lay in the dark listening to Noah breathe through the wall. That slow, soft rhythm that had become the only sound in the world she fully trusted. And then she swung her feet onto the cold floor and stood up before her body had time to argue. That was the trick. Don't think, just move. The second you started thinking about the bills or the broken refrigeration unit in the back room or the $600 invoice from the wholesale distributor that had been sitting on the counter for 3 weeks, you were done. You'd sit back down on the bed and stare at the ceiling and nothing would get done and the shop would die a little more quietly. So she didn't think. She pulled on her jeans and a thermal and her old canvas jacket with the frayed left cuff and went downstairs in the dark. The flower shop had no name anymore. There'd been a sign once. Her mother had hung it years before Evelyn took over the space, but the salt wind off the harbor had stripped the paint down to raw wood, and Evelyn had never scraped together the money or the energy to repaint it. People in the neighborhood just called it the Flower Place, or Evelyn's, or sometimes just the shop on the water, and she supposed that was enough. It was enough to survive on anyway, which was all she was doing most days. Surviving. She unlocked the back door and stepped into the alley behind the building where the delivery van was already idling, Marta behind the wheel with a travel mug of coffee and the radio going low. Marta was 63, had worked the wholesale flower market for 30 years before her knees gave out, and she drove for Evelyn 3 mornings a week in exchange for what Evelyn could pay her, which was never quite enough, and what Marta never complained about, which was everything. "You look terrible," Marta said. "Good morning to you too. The hydrangeas this week are garbage. I told them that. They'll argue." She handed over a clipboard with the manifest. "Sign now or sign later, doesn't matter." Evelyn signed without reading it. She'd been doing this long enough that she knew what she'd ordered, and she knew what they'd send, and the gap between those two things was always the part nobody wanted to discuss in writing anyway. They unloaded in the dark. Bucket after bucket of stems wrapped in wet newspaper, roses and ranunculus and eucalyptus, and the white lilies that had been on standing order since before Noah was born. When Evelyn was barely 22 and still believed that working hard enough and wanting something badly enough was basically the same thing as earning it. The hydrangeas were in fact garbage, half of them browning at the edges already, the blue faded toward gray. She set them aside and made a note to call the distributor when the office opened and knew she wouldn't because there was always something more urgent by 8 a.m. There was always something more urgent. By 6, she had the front cases loaded and the windows dressed and a pot of dark coffee going on the hot plate behind the counter. The harbor was waking up outside. Fishing boats heading out, a delivery truck backing up to the restaurant 2 doors down, the first light cutting flat and silver across the water. Evelyn stood in the doorway with her coffee and watched the way the light moved and tried to remember the last time she'd felt anything about it other than tired. Noah came down at 7:15 with his hair going 4 directions and his sneaker laces undone, and a look on his face like he'd been in the middle of a very important dream and was not entirely happy about being extracted from it. "Morning," she said. "Is there cereal?" "There's cereal. Laces." He bent down and tied them in that lopsided way he'd developed on his own because she'd never managed to teach him the rabbit ears method correctly, and she'd watched a video online once to learn the proper way and then never gotten around to fixing what he'd already figured out. He sat at the stool behind the counter where he ate breakfast every school morning, bowl in front of him, reading whatever chapter book he was in the middle of now, and Evelyn watched him for a moment the way she sometimes did, quietly, carefully, like she was memorizing him against some future emergency. and felt the familiar grip of something between love and terror that she didn't have a name for. He had her dark hair. He had her stubborn jaw. But his eyes were wrong, or not wrong exactly, just not hers. Gray and clear and direct in a way that sometimes made people stop mid-sentence when they looked at him, like they were trying to place something they couldn't quite identify. She'd stopped asking herself where those eyes came from a long time ago. She'd stopped a lot of things a long time ago. The shop opened properly at 8. The morning was slow, the way Tuesdays in late October always were. A man buying carnations who didn't make eye contact, a woman who wanted to know if they did arrangements for office lobbies and then left when Evelyn gave her the price. A kid from the coffee place down the block who came in once a week to buy a single stem of something for reasons Evelyn had never asked about. She sold a birthday arrangement to a woman who apologized twice for the budget and left a $3 tip, and she sold a funeral piece to a man in a suit who stood very still while she wrapped it and didn't say anything at all. And at 11 o'clock the envelope arrived. It always came on Tuesdays. She'd worked that out within the first few months. Always Tuesday, always before noon, always left on the counter by someone she never saw. She'd tried to catch them. She'd stood by the window. She'd asked Marta to watch the door. She'd even set up her old phone propped against a vase to record the entrance for a few weeks running. What she got was footage of the door, the sidewalk, the occasional customer, and then a cut to the envelope sitting on the counter like it had always been there, like it had grown up out of the wood overnight. She'd stopped trying to figure it out. The practical part of her brain, the part that had learned to triage what it could and couldn't afford to spend energy on, had simply filed it under things that were keeping her alive and moved on. The envelope contained cash, always exactly the right amount for the standing order, plus a tip that varied but was never less than 40%. Inside, on a small card in handwriting that was precise and slightly cramped, a note. White lilies. Blue hydrangeas. Fresh as you have them. That was it, every week for 8 years. No variation, no explanation, no name. She put the money in the register and tucked the card in the shoebox under the counter where she kept all the others and went back to work. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was that 20 minutes earlier, a black SUV had idled at the corner of the block for 7 minutes before pulling away, and that the man sitting in the back of it had held a photograph of a woman standing in a flower shop doorway, taken from a distance with a long lens, the image slightly blurred but identifiable, and that he'd been carrying that photograph for 4 years, and that this particular Tuesday, for reasons he hadn't fully explained to himself yet, he'd almost gotten out of the car. Adrian Knox had not been inside a flower shop since he was 9 years old, when his grandmother made him carry peonies to a neighbor's door after Adrian had broken her garden statue with a baseball that was aimed, he'd maintained then and maintained now, at a completely legitimate target. The experience had not left him with warm associations. He sat in the back of the SUV with the photograph face down on the seat beside him and watched Crane, his driver, check mirrors out of professional habit, and thought about what he was going to do and why he kept not doing it. "You want to go around again?" Crane asked. "No?" A pause. Crane was good at pauses. It was one of the things Adrian valued about him. The man understood that silence was not a vacuum to be filled. "Back to the office, then." "Back to the office." The SUV pulled away from the curb and Adrian looked at the harbor through the tinted glass as they passed. The water gray and cold under the October sky, the fishing boats, the light. He'd grown up 3 blocks from this waterfront. He'd learned what power meant in the warehouses at the far end of the dock. He'd spent the last 8 years building something that had swallowed the entire eastern seaboard's criminal infrastructure one piece at a time. And he'd done it from a distance, through intermediaries, through the kind of patience that most people in his business couldn't maintain past their second drink. People were afraid of Adrian Knox because he was smart, and because he was patient, and because he never, as far as anyone could determine, actually wanted anything for himself. A man without visible wants was impossible to leverage. You couldn't threaten what he loved because as far as the world knew, he didn't love anything. You couldn't buy him because he already had more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. You couldn't appeal to his ambition because he'd already won. What they didn't know, what only Crane and maybe 2 other people alive suspected, was that the patience wasn't strategy, It was grief that had calcified into something functional. And the empire wasn't ambition. It was the thing he'd built in the years when he couldn't find her, when finding her was the only thing he'd wanted and the only thing he'd been completely, utterly unable to do. 8 years. He'd spent 8 years looking. The private investigator he'd hired in the first year had turned up nothing. The man he'd sent after the private investigator when the nothing started to feel deliberate had turned up a falsified paper trail that dead-ended in a city she'd supposedly moved to, a name she'd supposedly changed, a life she'd supposedly built somewhere he wasn't. He'd spent 2 years believing it. He'd spent 2 more years hating her for it. And then he'd spent the remaining 4 realizing, piece by piece, with the slow grinding of a man who did not want to believe what he was beginning to understand, that none of it was real. The trail that led back to Boston, to this particular stretch of harbor, to a shop with a faded sign and hydrangeas in the window, had taken another 2 years and the kind of investment in information networks that would have funded a small country's intelligence service. It had come through a name, Marta Reyes, a woman who'd once, briefly, worked for a floral wholesaler connected to a logistics company that had, 8 years ago, been used to relocate one Evelyn Catherine Harper from a place she'd been taken from without her knowledge or consent. That was the phrase the investigator had used, without her knowledge or consent. Adrian had read that report in a room by himself and not moved for approximately 45 minutes. Then he'd folded it in half, put it in his jacket pocket, and gone back to work. He'd started the flower order the following Tuesday. He didn't fully understand why. The practical justification, that it kept the shop solvent, that it kept her in one location, that it maintained a thread of connection he could follow when he was ready, was real, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was something closer to, it was the only thing he could do that felt both honest and cowardly in equal measure, and he was not yet ready to be brave. That had been 4 years ago. He still wasn't ready. But he was getting to the point where not being ready was beginning to feel like its own kind of damage, and Adrian Knox had a very low tolerance for self-inflicted wounds. God. The afternoon brought a problem. It came in the form of Danny Marsh, who was 26 and had been doing odd jobs for the waterfront properties for the last 3 years, including, to Evelyn's persistent regret, occasional work for the man who owned the building her shop occupied. Danny had the specific quality of someone who believed he was more frightening than he was, which was a combination that tended to create trouble in exact proportion to how unchallenged it went. He came in at 2:30 after Noah had left for school pickup with Marta, and he didn't buy anything. He stood by the door with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the shop the way you look at a room you're thinking about rearranging. Mr. Holt says the lease renewal is going to be different this time, Danny said. Evelyn was cutting stems at the work table. She didn't look up. When's my current lease up? February? Then I have 4 months. He wants an answer by the end of the month. New terms. She set down the shears. What new terms? 30% increase, month to month after that instead of annual. The number landed in her chest like a stone. 30%. She did the math without wanting to. She did the math all the time, reflexively, the way some people check their phones. 30% would mean the standing order barely covered rent alone. It would mean nothing left for wholesale, for utilities, for Noah's school supplies or his winter coat, or the refrigeration unit that needed a repair she'd been putting off since July. Tell Mr. Holt I'll need to see it in writing, she said. He figured you'd say that. Danny looked around the shop again, not with any particular menace, just with the bored comfort of someone who knew they had the leverage. He also wanted me to mention that there are 2 other interested parties for the space. Good for them. Danny left. Evelyn stood at the work table for a long moment without moving, her hands flat on the wood, looking at the stems she'd been cutting. The lilies. Always the lilies. Fresh as you have them, the card always said, and she always had them fresh because the standing order meant she could afford to. And now the standing order might not be enough, and she was back to the edge of the same cliff she'd been standing at the edge of for 8 years, and she was so tired of the edge. She picked up the shears and went back to work because there was nothing else to do. At 4 o'clock, the door opened. She heard it and called out from the back without looking up, "Just a moment," and finished the cut she was making and wiped her hands on the towel on her shoulder and came around the work table and stopped. The man standing in her shop was not a customer. She knew that in the first half second, the way you knew things sometimes before you'd process them consciously. Not because he looked threatening, exactly, but because he looked like someone who was used to rooms adjusting themselves to his presence rather than the other way around. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a dark coat that fit him the way expensive things fit people who'd never had to think about the cost. Dark hair, going slightly gray at the temples. A face that had been handsome once and was something more severe than handsome now, all sharp angles and careful stillness. He was looking at the lilies in the front case. "Those are fresh this morning," Evelyn said, because she had to say something. "The hydrangeas are—" She paused. "The hydrangeas had a rough week. I can give you a discount on those." The man looked at her. His eyes were gray and direct, and when they landed on her face, something moved in them. Not recognition, not exactly, more like the thing that happens right before recognition. The scramble of a mind trying to match a face it knows to a face it's seeing. "How long have you had this shop?" he asked. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that didn't fluctuate much, that stayed at one register, whether it was ordering coffee or ordering something less ordinary. 8 years, she said. The stillness in his face shifted, almost imperceptibly, but she'd spent 8 years reading the small signals that people gave off when they didn't mean to. Something about the number had hit him. She didn't know why. "Do you do standing orders?" he asked. "I do." "White lilies, blue hydrangeas." He said it flatly, like a test. "Whatever's freshest." The shop went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with noise. The refrigeration unit hummed. Somewhere outside, a boat horn sounded across the harbor. Evelyn looked at the man in the dark coat. She thought about 8 years of Tuesday envelopes. She thought about the handwriting she'd memorized without meaning to, the same precise, cramped letters every single week. She thought about the way she'd stopped trying to figure it out because it was keeping her alive and she couldn't afford to question the things keeping her alive. "I already have that order," she said carefully. "I know," he said. And that was when Evelyn Harper understood, in the space of a single breath, that the luck she'd been living on for 8 years was not luck at all, that someone had known where she was, that someone had been watching, that the anonymous lifeline she'd never questioned had a face, and the face was standing in front of her right now, and the face was a stranger's, and it wasn't. It was something that sat at the base of her skull like a frequency she'd been tuned to once and never fully escaped. She took one step back without meaning to. Her hip caught the edge of the work table. "Who are you?" she asked. The door from the back stairs banged open and Noah came through it at speed, the way he always came through it, all forward momentum and no brakes, his backpack hanging off one shoulder and his hair still going 4 directions from the school day. "Mom, Marta says if you don't fix the van's back doors, she's going to start making you ride on the—" He stopped when he saw the man. The man stopped looking at Evelyn. He looked at the boy. And whatever careful stillness had been holding his face together for the last 4 minutes simply stopped working. Something crossed his expression that Evelyn had no name for, something raw and private and completely involuntary, and she watched it happen and felt the cold move up from the base of her spine in a slow wave, because she knew without knowing why that she was watching a man see something he had not expected to see. Something that had rearranged the entire architecture of whatever he'd thought he was walking into when he came through her door. Noah had dark hair like her. He had her stubborn jaw and her narrow hands. But his eyes, gray and clear and direct, were looking at the stranger in the dark coat. And the stranger's eyes, gray and clear and direct, exactly the same, were looking back. "Noah?" Evelyn said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "Go upstairs." "Mom, who is upstairs?" The one word with all the weight she had. Now. Noah looked at her. He looked at the man. He was 7 years old, and he was smart in the way that quiet children were sometimes alarmingly smart, and she watched him calculating something she couldn't see before he turned and went back through the door and up the stairs, his footsteps deliberate on each step. The shop was quiet again. "That's my son," Evelyn said. She said it the way you'd establish ownership of something you were prepared to die defending. I can see that, Adrian Knox said. His voice had changed. The evenness was still there, but it was doing more work now, holding something back. What's his name? Why? What's his name? He asked again, and this time it wasn't a question. Evelyn looked at this man, this stranger who was not entirely a stranger, who had been keeping her lights on for 8 years for reasons she suddenly, terrifyingly, needed to understand, and felt the floor shift under everything she'd built in the last 8 years, every careful structure of silence and survival and not asking and just keep going, all of it trembling at the foundation. "Tell me who you are first," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and set something on the work table between them. A photograph, old, worn at the edges, the kind of thing that had been handled too many times. She looked at it. It was her. Years younger, her hair longer, standing somewhere she couldn't immediately place, laughing at something off camera. She didn't recognize the setting at first, and then she did. A waterfront, not this one. A different city, a different life. A version of herself that had existed before Noah and before the shop and before the careful silence of the last 8 years. Before the night she'd woken up in a city she didn't recognize, with no memory of how she'd gotten there, with a note telling her that Adrian Knox never wanted to see her again. She looked up from the photograph. "Adrian," she said. Not a question, not anything she'd intended to say out loud. Just the word, falling out of her like something she'd been holding for a very long time. The man across the work table, the man whose eyes she'd been looking at in her son's face for 7 years without letting herself think about it, not once, not ever, because thinking about it meant pulling on a thread she'd decided she could not afford to pull, looked at her with the gray eyes that had unmade her once and seemed fully prepared to do it again. "There she is," he said quietly, almost to himself. And from upstairs came the sound of Noah's footsteps, pacing the length of his room the way he did when he was thinking about something, back and forth, wearing a track in the floor above the only home either of them had ever really had. Evelyn gripped the edge of the work table. Whatever came next was going to cost her something. She could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives, in the pressure, in the quality of the silence, in the way everything suddenly seemed to be holding very still. She just didn't know yet that the price was already set. That 3 hours from now, a man on the other side of the city was going to receive a phone call. That the phone call would contain 2 words, a name and a location. That the man who received it had spent 8 years believing Adrian Knox's heir didn't exist, and that belief was the only thing standing between Noah Harper and the most dangerous network on the eastern seaboard. She didn't know that. She just stood in her flower shop with her hands on the work table and looked at the man who had, without her knowledge, been keeping her alive, and understood for the first time that the anonymous lifeline had never been protection. It had been a beacon, and someone had just followed it home. The photograph sat on the work table between them like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Evelyn hadn't touched it. She wasn't going to touch it. Touching it would mean acknowledging that it was real, that the woman in it was her, that the man standing 6 feet away had been carrying her face in his coat pocket for God only knew how long, and she was not ready to acknowledge any of that yet. She needed another 30 seconds of pretending she was still in charge of this situation. She didn't get them. "How long have you had that?" she asked. 4 years? And before that? "Before that, I thought you were somewhere else." A pause. "I thought a lot of things." She looked at him directly. It took effort, not because he was frightening exactly, though he was, in the particular way of men who had learned to make stillness do the work that other men did with volume. It took effort because looking at him meant continuing to process what her body had already understood, that this was Adrian Knox, that Adrian Knox was standing in her flower shop, that Adrian Knox had gray eyes, and her son had gray eyes, and she had spent 7 years not thinking about that. "You need to leave," she said. "Not yet." "I'm not asking. Neither am I." He said it without heat, which was worse than if he'd said it with heat. He wasn't threatening her. He was just stating the terms of something she hadn't agreed to. "The boy, don't." "Evelyn." "Don't say his name. You don't get to say his name." She was aware her voice had climbed slightly, and she brought it back down. Control. She'd learned control the hard way, in the first year alone, when falling apart was a luxury she couldn't afford because there was no one else. You need to leave and come back when I've had time to. I need time. I know you need time. He hadn't moved from where he was standing, hadn't shifted his weight or adjusted his coat or done any of the physical things people did when they were uncomfortable. He just stood there like he'd been built into the room. I also need you to understand that time is the one thing we may not have a lot of right now. Something in the way he said it made her go still. Not the words. The words could mean anything. The weight behind them. The specific quality of someone reporting a fact they wished were otherwise. What does that mean? She asked. He looked at the front window. It was a brief look, practiced, the kind of scan that had clearly been performed so many times it didn't register as deliberate anymore. Then back to her. Were you followed here today? She asked, and then heard herself ask it and felt the absurdity of it. She ran a flower shop. She asked customers whether they wanted their stems wrapped, and now she was asking a man if he'd been followed. I'm always followed, Adrian said. The question is whether the right people were watching. And were they? He didn't answer that directly. Is there somewhere we can talk that isn't in front of a window? She took him to the back room, which was where she did the real work. The cutting and wiring and the long-form arrangements that took concentration, and which was also, she realized the moment they were both in it, extremely small. The room held a work table, 2 refrigeration units, shelving along every wall, and now Adrian knocks, and the remaining square footage was roughly enough for one person to turn around in without apologizing. She didn't apologize. She crossed her arms and stood with her back to the shelving and looked at him. Talk, she said. He looked around the back room first, not evaluating it the way Danny Marsh had looked at the shop, not with that proprietary boredom. More like a man cataloging exits, which should have been alarming but somehow landed as simply what he was, a thing he did the way other people check the weather before leaving the house. 8 years ago, he started. I know what happened 8 years ago. Do you? I woke up in Providence with $40 and a note that said you were done with me. Yes, I know. Something crossed his face, quick and involuntary. What did the note say exactly? She'd burned the note. She'd burned it in the parking lot of the motel where she'd woken up, on her second day there, when she'd finally decided she was going to stop waiting for an explanation that wasn't coming. She still remembered every word of it. That you'd made arrangements for me to start over, that it was better this way, that I shouldn't try to contact you. She kept her voice flat. She'd had a lot of practice. It was in your handwriting. It wasn't my handwriting. It was a very good imitation then. Yes, he said. It was. The refrigeration unit hummed. From upstairs, she could hear Noah's footsteps, still pacing. She needed to go up and check on him. She needed to do approximately 14 other things that were not standing in a small room with this man, while the understanding of the last 8 years began to rearrange itself in ways she was not equipped to handle at 4:30 on a Tuesday. You said you thought I was somewhere else, she said, before the photograph. I was told you'd moved, built a new life, that you'd made the choice voluntarily. Who told you that? He didn't answer immediately, and that pause, that specific weighted pause, told her more than the answer would have. Who? She said again. Someone I trusted, Adrian said. Someone who had access to everything, my correspondence, my networks, my location at any given time. He looked at her steadily. Someone who intercepted every letter you sent me and every letter I sent you and replaced them with things we didn't write. The floor shifted again. She'd been living on a shifted floor for about 20 minutes now, and she was getting tired of the sensation. I sent you letters, she said. I know. You never responded. I never received them. She looked at him. He looked at her. The 8 years sat between them like a third person in the room, taking up all the remaining space. Who? She asked. Third time. Caldwell? Adrian said. Richard Caldwell. The name meant something to her. It meant a man with silver hair and a patient smile who had run the operational side of Adrian's business with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been doing it so long it had become invisible. It meant handshakes at functions she'd been brought to and then left in corners at. It meant a man who had always been there, in the background, exactly where you stopped noticing things. He was your estate manager, she said. He was a great deal more than that. Adrian's voice had gone very even, very controlled, the voice of someone managing something that wanted to become something else. He ran everything, and I let him because he was good at it, and because I trusted him, and because I was, a pause, focused on other things. On me, she said. Yes. And then when he made you think I'd left, I stopped being focused on anything for a while. He said it like a statement of fact, not self-pity, and she believed it because it had no softness in it. And then I rebuilt what he'd helped me build, and I did it differently, and I became something I probably should have been more careful about becoming. She understood what he was telling her. She'd lived in this harbor neighborhood long enough to know who Adrian Knox was, or who the name meant to the people who said it in low voices. She wasn't naive, she'd simply been very careful for 8 years not to connect the name to the gray-eyed man she'd once. Why now? She asked. Why walk through that door today? Because Caldwell knows you're here. The back room got very quiet. He's known for 6 months, Adrian continued. I found out 3 days ago. He's been building something. I don't have the full shape of it yet, but the intelligence coming back to me says your son's existence is now known to people who understand what it means. What does it mean? She said. Though she knew, she already knew, she'd known it the moment she'd watched Adrian look at Noah's eyes. It means he's my heir, legitimate, by blood, which matters enormously to the organizations I've spent 8 years consolidating. He looked at her without flinching. It means that to certain people, controlling Noah means controlling everything I've built. Evelyn uncrossed her arms. She pressed her palms flat against the shelving behind her. She needed something solid. He's 7 years old, she said. I know. He collects rocks from the harbor, and he can't sleep without a specific blanket, and he's 7 years old. I know, Evelyn. Don't. She stopped, breathed. Don't tell me you know like that fixes something. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not here to fix it from in front of you. I'm here because staying away is now more dangerous than being here. She wanted to argue with that. She wanted to find the flaw in it, the place where he was wrong, the exit from this conversation that led back to the life she'd been carefully managing. She couldn't find it. She was good at math, and the math was not cooperating. What do you need from me? She asked. Tonight, nothing. I need you to act like this conversation didn't happen. Keep the shop open tomorrow. Normal routine. He looked at the ceiling briefly, which was Noah's floor. Keep him close. I always keep him close. Closer. She nodded once. It cost her something, that nod. And then? She asked. And then I go find out exactly what Caldwell is doing and I shut it down. Just like that. Not just like that. But yes. She looked at him. This man who had aged into something harder than what she remembered, who wore the years of whatever he'd built like armor that fit too well, and felt the weight of everything she hadn't let herself feel for 8 years trying to come in through every door at once. She slammed them. All of them. Not now. Not while he was standing in front of her, and not while Noah was upstairs, and not while she still didn't know if she could trust a single word of this. How do I know you're telling me the truth? She asked. You don't, he said simply. Not yet. He was gone by 5. Crane brought the SUV around, and Adrian got in without looking back at the shop, which was the only version of discipline he had left on the subject, and Crane pulled away from the curb and didn't ask anything until they were 4 blocks clear. Well, Crane said. She didn't know. Any of it. Adrian was looking at his hands. The note, the letters, none of it. You believe her? I do. A pause. Crane navigated the harbor traffic with the patience of a man who did everything at one speed. And the boy? Adrian didn't answer that for long enough that it became its own answer. Caldwell moves faster than I expected, he said finally. Get me Reyes. The investigator? The other one. Crane made a call. Adrian looked out the window at the harbor going dark. The lights coming on in the restaurants and the bait shops and the apartments above them, all that ordinary life stacked on top of the water, and thought about a woman standing in a back room with her hands pressed against shelving like she was holding the wall up and a 7-year-old boy with his eyes who collected rocks from the harbor, and 8 years of Tuesday envelopes that had never once been enough. Upstairs, Noah was sitting on his bed with his chapter book open on his lap and not reading it. He was thinking about the man's eyes. He'd seen them for maybe 5 seconds before his mom had sent him upstairs, but 5 seconds was enough. He had a good memory. His teacher said so, his mom said so, Marta said so, with the particular emphasis of someone who had been on the wrong end of it. And the memory had already filed the man's face away with the precision that it filed everything away, cross-referenced and indexed and available. The man had looked at him the way people sometimes looked at him, and then looked at his mom, and then looked at him again, like they were solving something. He'd never quite understood why people did that. He was starting to understand sitting on his bed with his chapter book open on the wrong page, the harbor making its nighttime sounds outside his window. He heard his mom come up the stairs. He heard her stop outside his door. He heard the pause that meant she was deciding how to start. "Come in," he said. She came in and sat on the edge of his bed and looked at him with the expression that meant she was going to tell him something true, but not tell him all of it yet. He'd learned to read that expression when he was about 4. "Who was he?" Noah asked. "Someone I used to know." "From before?" She looked at him. He'd always said before for the time before he could remember, the part of his mom's life that existed in a few photographs and a lot of careful silence. She'd never corrected him for it. "Yes," she said, "from before." "Is he coming back?" She put her hand on his head briefly, the way she did when she wanted to comfort him and also needed to hold on to something. "I don't know yet." "Okay," Noah said. He went back to his book, or pretended to. He gave her enough time to believe it. After she left, he sat and thought about gray eyes and the way the man had gone completely still when he'd come through the door, and the particular quality of that stillness, and he thought, adults think you don't notice things. Adults were wrong about that, all the time. Richard Caldwell received the phone call at 5:47 in the study of his Beacon Hill townhouse, sitting behind the desk where he'd conducted the relevant business of his career for the last 30 years, and listened to the 2-minute report with the same patient expression he brought to everything. "She spoke to him?" he said. 20 minutes. He went in alone, left without incident. And the child was there. Briefly, Caldwell set down his pen. He'd been writing something. Correspondence, always correspondence. The disciplined maintenance of relationships that had made him indispensable to 3 generations of the Knox organization's infrastructure, which was to say indispensable to the infrastructure itself, since the Knox name was simply what the public face was called, while the actual machinery had always run through Caldwell's hands. "He'll know it was me," Caldwell said. "He'll have known for some time, actually. Adrian is not a man who reaches conclusions slowly." A pause. "He walked through that door today because he's decided he's ready to act." "What do you want to do?" What Caldwell wanted to do was the same thing he'd wanted to do for 8 years, which was maintain the arrangement he'd constructed with meticulous care. The arrangement in which Adrian Knox was a figurehead of expanding power while Caldwell controlled the actual flow of money, information, and loyalty, which were the 3 things that actually constituted power when you stripped everything else away. He'd built that arrangement on a single necessary piece of engineering, removing the woman. Adrian without Evelyn was a weapon, contained, directable, and entirely focused on the Empire because the Empire was all he had. Adrian with Evelyn was something messier and more autonomous. A man with an anchor who might, at any point, decide that what he'd built was not worth what it was costing him. And Adrian with a son, Adrian with an heir, was something Caldwell had not, 8 years ago, anticipated needing to account for. That oversight had been expensive. He was now in the position of correcting it. "Tell Markov the timeline moves up," Caldwell said. "I want the woman approached tonight." "Approached how?" "Informatively. She should understand her situation clearly before she makes any decisions that close doors for her." He picked his pen back up. "And Marcus, make sure whoever goes is someone Adrian won't recognize. We're not ready for that conversation yet." The call ended. Caldwell looked at the pen in his hand for a moment. It was a good pen. He'd had it for 20 years, a gift from a man who was now dead, whose death he had not arranged but had not prevented either, which was one of the useful distinctions in his line of work. He went back to writing. Bam. The knock came at 9:15. Noah was asleep. Evelyn knew because she'd checked 3 times. The specific, irrational repetition of a parent whose body had decided that danger was close and that checking counted as doing something. She'd locked the front, locked the back, checked the latch on the alley door, and then stood in the kitchen with a cup of tea going cold in her hands and told herself she was being paranoid. Then the knock came. 3 times. Measured. The back door. She set the tea down. She picked up the phone and thought about calling. Who? The police? Adrian Knox? She didn't have Adrian's number. She had a man who'd walked into her shop and upended everything she knew and then left, and no way to reach him. She picked up the shears from the dish rack where they'd been drying. It was a terrible weapon. She went to the back door anyway. Through the small window in the door, she could see a man she didn't recognize, late 30s, big through the shoulders, dressed like someone trying to look unremarkable. He wasn't holding anything. He was looking at the door with the patience of someone who knew she was on the other side of it. She didn't open the door. "What do you want?" "I have a message," he said through the glass. "From Mr. Caldwell." She didn't know the name. She thought she didn't know the name. And then she did. Not from anywhere she'd consciously stored it, but from the conversation in the back room, from Adrian's voice going flat and controlled and measured. Someone I trusted, someone who had access to everything. "I don't know who that is," she said. "Mr. Caldwell thought you'd say that." The man's voice was patient, professionally patient. "He'd like you to know that he's aware of the conversation you had this afternoon. He'd like you to know that the decisions you make in the next 24 hours will determine the options available to you and to your son going forward." A pause. "He'd also like you to know that he is, at this point, the more stable option." Evelyn gripped the shears. "Tell him I don't know what he's talking about," she said. "He thought you might say that too." The man reached into his jacket. She tensed and held a card up to the window. A phone number. Just a number. No name. "When you're ready. Before midnight tonight would be ideal." He set the card on the sill below the window and walked away. She watched him go to the end of the alley, turn right, disappear. She stood at the back door with the shears in her hand and the card on the sill and the sound of Noah sleeping upstairs, and understood in one clean and terrible moment that Adrian Knox had been right about one thing with absolute precision. Time was the one thing they didn't have. She took the card. She went back inside. She stood in her kitchen and looked at the phone number and thought about a woman who had woken up in Providence with $40 and a note and rebuilt her entire life on the assumption that she was on her own, that on her own was the only safe thing to be. That need was a door that let things in you couldn't get back out. Then she went to the register under the counter, behind the shoebox of Tuesday envelopes, behind the spare tape and the box of twist ties and the invoice book she never updated often enough. She found the piece of paper she'd put there 6 months ago when a man she'd hired to look into the building's ownership history had come back with an address instead. Not the building's address, a different address, one she'd filed away and told herself she would never use because using it meant admitting she knew something she'd decided not to know. An address in the South End, a street she'd driven past once, carefully, and not stopped. She took out her phone. She dialed. It rang twice. "I didn't think you'd call this fast," Adrian Knox said. "Someone came to my back door," Evelyn said. "Caldwell. He knows about this afternoon." She kept her voice low and steady, the voice she used when everything was going badly and Noah was in the next room. "He wants me to call him. He wants me to call him before midnight, and he called himself the more stable option." A silence on the other end that was not an empty silence. "Don't call him," Adrian said. "I wasn't going to." "Good. Adrian." She said the name for the second time today, and it still felt like something she'd picked up without knowing if it would cut her. "Whatever this is, whatever is coming, I need you to understand something. Tell me. Noah is not a piece in this. Whatever was between us, whatever Caldwell did, whatever you've built or want to tear down, he is not a piece in it." "I know. I need you to say that like you mean it." Another silence. Different texture from the last one. "He's not a piece," Adrian said. "He's the reason I should have walked through your door 4 years ago instead of today, and I didn't, and that's going to be something I carry. A pause. But I'm here now. Evelyn closed her eyes for 1 second, just one. Then she opened them. What happens next? She asked. What happened next was that Adrian started to answer and then stopped, and the quality of his silence changed in a way that made the hair on her arms lift before she understood why. And then she heard it too, faint through the phone, a sound he was hearing in real time from wherever he was. Tires on pavement, an engine cutting, doors. "Get Noah," Adrian said. His voice had changed entirely. The control was still there, but something was moving underneath it now, something urgent and cold. "Right now. Take him and go to the front of the building, the street side, and do not open any door until you hear my voice." "Adrian, what's Evelyn?" One word, stripped of everything except the thing underneath. "Move." She was already moving. Up the stairs, Noah's door, the blanket, the warm weight of her half-asleep son who made the confused sound of a child extracted from dreams too quickly, and she had him in her arms and she was coming back down the stairs before she'd fully registered the smell. Smoke. Thin, first, then not thin. From the back of the building, the back door, the alley, where the man with the card had been standing 9 minutes ago, something had started that was not going to stop on its own. And Evelyn Harper ran toward the front of her shop with her son's face pressed against her shoulder and the shears still in her hand and 8 years of careful survival burning behind her. She hit the front door with her shoulder and got it open, and the October air came in cold and sharp, and she pulled Noah through it onto the sidewalk and turned to look back through the glass at the orange glow, already eating through the back wall, climbing the shelving, finding the dried eucalyptus and the ribbon spools and all the small combustible architecture of the life she'd built. The lilies in the front case were the last thing she saw before the smoke took the window. Noah was awake now, fully awake, the way children snapped into clarity when something primal was happening, his arms around her neck and his face very still. "Mom," he said. Not a question, just her name, said like an anchor. "I've got you," she said. "I've got you." Headlights at the end of the block, a black SUV that didn't slow down for the turn, that covered the distance between the corner and the curb in front of them in the time it took Evelyn to decide whether to run, and then Crane was out of the driver's door and Adrian was out of the other side, and he crossed the distance between them in 4 steps and stopped. He looked at Noah first, checking. The way you checked something you hadn't known you needed until 3 hours ago, with the particular focus of someone who was very good at not showing what things cost him and was temporarily failing at it. Then he looked at Evelyn. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Both of you. In the car. Now." She didn't argue. That was the moment she understood how completely the ground had shifted. That she was putting her son in a car with Adrian Knox and not arguing, because the building behind her was burning, and a man named Caldwell had sent someone to her back door in the world she'd constructed so carefully on the assumption that she was safer alone had just demonstrated, with considerable finality, that it was finished. Noah looked at Adrian as Evelyn buckled him in. The gray eyes, both sets, steady on each other in the dark interior of the SUV. "You have the same eyes as me," Noah said. Adrian looked at the boy for one long moment. Something moved across his face that he didn't try to stop. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I do." He closed the door. He got in. Crane already had the engine running, already had eyes on the mirrors, already had the route planned for wherever they were going next, because that was what Crane did. Behind them, the flower shop burned. The Tuesday envelopes. The shoebox. The lilies. All of it. Evelyn watched it through the rear window until the block disappeared and understood that there was no version of tomorrow that looked anything like yesterday. There was no going back. There was only whatever Adrian Knox was about to do next, and whether she was willing to do it with him. Crane drove without being told where to go, which meant Adrian had already told him before any of this started, which meant Adrian had planned for this contingency before he'd walked through her door that afternoon, and Evelyn sat in the back seat with Noah's weight warm and solid against her side and looked at the back of Adrian's head and thought, "He knew this was coming, and he came anyway, and he let me think I had until tomorrow." She filed that away. She had a long list of things to file away and deal with later, and she was rapidly running out of later. Noah had gone quiet in the way he went quiet when he was processing something too large for immediate comment. He sat with his shoulder pressed against Evelyn's arm and looked out the window at the city moving past and didn't ask where they were going, which meant he'd already decided that asking wasn't going to get him anything useful yet. 7 years old and already that calibration. She didn't know whether to be proud or gutted about it. The SUV crossed into Charlestown and then off the main roads, into the tighter streets of a neighborhood that had been industrial once and was now the specific combination of industrial and expensive that happened when money moved into a place and decided the bones were worth keeping. Crane pulled into an underground parking structure attached to a building that had no signage visible from the street, and the gate came down behind them before Evelyn fully registered they'd stopped. "Where are we?" she asked. "Safe house," Adrian said. He was already out of the car, scanning the garage the way he'd scanned the flower shop window, the automatic survey of a man who had stopped trusting rooms a long time ago. "It's not connected to anything Caldwell knows about. I had it set up 2 years ago under a name he can't trace." "You've been planning this for 2 years. I've been planning for contingencies for 2 years. He opened her door. "There's a difference." "Is there?" He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes that he didn't let reach his face. "Come inside." The apartment on the 3rd floor was spare in the way that safe houses were spare. Functional furniture, blackout curtains already drawn, a kitchen stocked with the basics, 2 bedrooms, nothing on the walls. It had the specific impersonality of a place that had been prepared for crisis rather than lived in, and it smelled like paint and recycled air and nothing that belonged to anyone. Noah walked through it with the evaluating thoroughness of a child taking inventory and announced that it needed a rug, which was the most Noah thing Evelyn had heard all day, and she felt something break open in her chest briefly before she sealed it back up. Crane sat up in the main room with a laptop and a phone and became very still and very focused, which Evelyn gathered was his version of active work. Adrian took her into the kitchen, which was the closest thing to private the apartment offered with Noah doing his inspection, and stood at the counter and looked at her with the expression of a man who had several things to say and was determining the order. "Tell me exactly what the man at the door said," Adrian said. She told him. Word for word. She had the memory for it. She'd been replaying it since it happened. Caldwell's name, the more stable option, the card, the midnight deadline. Adrian listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He moved faster than I calculated," he said. "You said that last time, about him moving fast. Last time I was wrong by hours. Tonight he moved faster than hours." His jaw had tightened by a degree she could only see because she was close enough. "Which means he has a source inside my network that's more current than I knew." "Someone told him you came to the shop today." "Yes." "Someone who knew you were going." "Yes." "How many people knew?" He looked at her. 2, Crane and 1 other. She let that sit for a moment. "Crane's out there running your communications right now. Crane's been with me for 11 years. Caldwell was with you longer." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man encountering an argument he didn't want to be valid. He held her gaze and she held his, and neither of them looked away, and then he turned to the doorway. "Crane." Crane appeared immediately, laptop under his arm. "Yeah." "Who else knew about the Harper shop today?" "Exact list." Crane didn't hesitate. "You, me, and Reyes. Reyes got the brief at 10 this morning." "Where's Reyes now?" A pause. Small, but there. "I haven't been able to raise him since 6. Adrian's expression didn't change. That was the tell. That it didn't change when it should have. "Since before the fire." "Yes." "Find him," Adrian said. "Everything else stops until you find him." Crane went back to the main room. Evelyn watched Adrian stand at the kitchen counter and absorb this information. That the person who'd leaked his movements to Caldwell was likely a man named Reyes, who had known for 8 hours and who had gone quiet before the fire, which was the kind of timing that had only one interpretation. "How much did Reyes know?" she asked. "Enough." Adrian's voice was flat. "The shop address. The standing order. The fact that I believed you might be the woman I'd been looking for." a pause that cost him something. He would have had access to the investigation files, everything from the last 4 years. So Caldwell knows all of it. Yes. He knows about Noah. He already knew about Noah. That's why I came today. He looked at her. Evelyn, I need you to understand that Rhea's knowing doesn't change the operational picture significantly. What it changes is the timeline. Caldwell now knows I've made contact. He knows I'm moving, which means he stops waiting, she said. Yes. From the main room, Noah called out that he'd found a deck of cards in a drawer and wanted to know if anyone knew how to play poker. And despite everything, despite the burning shop and the man at the back door and the name Caldwell landing in her life like a stone through glass, Evelyn felt the specific and completely involuntary pull of her son's voice the way she always felt it, the gravitational constant of her life for 7 years. In a little while, baby, she called back. She looked at Adrian. He doesn't know how to play poker. No, Adrian said, and something in his face shifted very slightly in a direction she wasn't prepared to look at directly. I could teach him. Don't. She said it quietly, without heat. Not yet. Not until I know what this is. He nodded. He understood what she meant, or she thought he did, that she wasn't talking about poker. Crane found Reyes at 11:40. Or rather, Crane found what was left of the situation Reyes had created. A motel in Revere, paid cash, checked in under a name that took Crane's contacts 40 minutes to unravel. Reyes himself answered the door when Crane knocked, which surprised everyone, because men who burned their employers' assets and went dark before the fire usually had more of a head start. Evelyn stayed with Noah. Adrian went to Revere. He came back at 1 in the morning and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the middle distance for approximately 30 seconds before he registered that Evelyn was still up, sitting at the kitchen table with cold coffee and the specific alertness of someone who had decided that sleeping was not something their body was going to cooperate with. Well, she said. Adrian sat down across from her. This was the first time he'd sat down in her presence, and it changed something about the geometry of the conversation, made it smaller and more direct. Reyes didn't give Caldwell my movements today, he said. Then who? Reyes has been feeding Caldwell information for 14 months. He put his hands flat on the table, looked at them. But that's not what he told me tonight. She waited. He told me that Caldwell didn't need a source inside my network to know about the shop. Caldwell has known about the shop since the day I started the standing order. He looked up. He knew because he set it up. The kitchen tilted, not literally, but the interpretation of the last 8 years tilted so completely and so suddenly that Evelyn gripped the edge of the table. What, she said, the standing order, the Tuesday envelopes. Adrian's voice was doing the controlled flat thing again, the thing that was costing him more than it sounded. Reyes had access to the original documentation from when I had you investigated. I thought I'd set that trail up independently. I thought Caldwell didn't know I'd found you. He paused. He knew. He's known for 4 years. The money going to your shop. He let it continue because it kept you in one location. Because it meant he always knew where you were. Evelyn sat very still. He was using your money, she said, to keep me in place. Yes. The thing that I thought was keeping me alive was keeping you findable. He said it like a man delivering a sentence he'd already given himself. I'm sorry. I need you to know that I thought I was protecting you. I thought it was the one thing I was doing right. She looked at him. She believed him, which was the complicated part because believing him meant the betrayal was Caldwell's and not Adrian's, and believing that meant restructuring the last 8 years yet again, and she was running out of structural capacity for the evening. Why did Caldwell wait? She asked. If he knew where I was for 4 years? Because you weren't useful until Noah was, Adrian said. A woman in a flower shop, no connections, no assets. You were leverage in reserve. The moment Caldwell's sources confirmed that Noah was my biological son, you became something worth deploying. What changed 6 months ago? My consolidation of the Markov network, Adrian said. 3 organizations, combined assets in the 9 figures, loyalty structures that have been in place for 40 years. Whoever controls the succession controls all of it, and succession in these structures is determined by blood. He looked at her steadily. I never formalized a successor because I never planned to need one. I planned to dismantle the whole thing before it became necessary, and Caldwell knew that. Caldwell built the thing with me. He knew every plan I had. Something crossed his face. He also knew that if a legitimate blood heir surfaced, a child, documented, undeniable, the organizations would transfer their loyalty to the heir over any named successor, over Caldwell. So Noah being alive, Evelyn said, and had to stop and breathe through it, threatens everything Caldwell has built. Yes. Then why not? She stopped. Why not move against him directly? Adrian said. Flat. Because a dead child creates a martyr and a cause. It consolidates the organizations against whoever did it. Caldwell is too smart for that. He looked at the table. What he wants is control of Noah, guardianship, the ability to make decisions in the heir's name while the heir is a minor. The word guardianship sat in the room like something with teeth. Over my dead body, Evelyn said. That's what I'm trying to prevent, Adrian said. And then, because he was apparently constitutionally incapable of letting anything be easier than it needed to be. There's something else. She looked at him. He reached into his coat and put a folder on the table. Not thick, 6 or 8 pages. He didn't open it. Reyes brought this. He'd been holding it for 2 months, waiting for the right moment to use it for his own leverage. He gave it to me tonight instead because, Adrian paused, because I was persuasive about the importance of full disclosure. She didn't ask what persuasive meant in this context. She opened the folder. The first page was a financial document, wire transfers, dates, account numbers. It took her a moment to parse the structure because she wasn't a financial person, and then she was, because the pattern was simple enough once you saw it. Money moving from accounts belonging to the Knox organization into a secondary structure, and from that structure into accounts she didn't recognize, and the dates on the transfers went back. She turned to the second page to confirm, and her breath went out of her slowly. 16 years. 16 years of money moving through Richard Caldwell's hands into something else. He's been building a parallel structure, she said. For longer than I've known him, Adrian said. The organizations I consolidated over the last 8 years. I thought I was building something new. I was building something he designed. He needed my name, my reputation, my ability to negotiate and enforce. He's been using me as the visible mechanism of an infrastructure that's entirely his. She turned to the third page and stopped. Names. A long column of names, dates beside each one, and a single word repeated in the rightmost column. Deceased. She knew some of the names, not all of them, but enough. People who had been in Adrian's orbit over the years, whose deaths had been attributed to the ordinary violence of the world they operated in. These aren't casualties, she said. No. He killed them. Had them killed when they got close to understanding what he was doing, or when they became more useful dead than alive. Adrian's voice was very controlled. There are 41 names on that list. 41 people I lost over 8 years who I believe died in the course of what I'd built. His hands, flat on the table, had tightened. They didn't. He killed them. He used my organization to kill them, and I didn't see it. Evelyn looked at him, at the rigid line of his jaw, at the thing he was holding down with both hands through the sheer force of the composure he'd spent years constructing. Adrian, she said, I'm all right. You're not. No, he said after a moment. I'm not. He looked at the folder. But I need to be. She turned to the last page of the folder and stopped breathing. It was a document she recognized. Not the specific document. She'd never seen this specific document, but the type. A legal filing. Custody proceedings, the kind initiated in jurisdictions specifically selected for their speed and opacity, and the specific convenience of judges who had, over many years, developed productive relationships with parties who could afford productive relationships. Her name was on it, Noah's name. And the petitioner's name was not Richard Caldwell. It was Adrian Knox. She looked up. Adrian was looking at the table. "This was filed 3 months ago," she said, "in the Cayman courts." "I know. Your name is on this." "I know. This is a petition to transfer primary custody of Noah to you, on the grounds that his mother—" She turned the page because she needed to read it. She needed to read exactly what it said. "On the grounds that his mother is a person of unstable circumstances, financially insolvent, unfit to provide adequate security." She set the page down with great precision. "Adrian." He looked at her then, and for the first time since he'd walked into her shop, the composure was fully gone. Not replaced by anything dramatic, just absent, leaving behind something that looked tired and old and genuinely ashamed. "I filed that before I knew the full picture," he said. "Before Reyes told me about Caldwell tonight, I thought if Caldwell moved against Noah, a legal claim in my name would give me grounds to extract him through legitimate channels. I thought it was a protective measure. It's a custody filing. Against me. It was a contingency. I was going to, I intended to tell you." "When?" "When I had more to offer than a burning building and an apology." She stood up from the table. She needed to stand. She needed the distance and the altitude and the ability to look down at the folder from standing rather than from sitting, because sitting felt like something was on top of her. "You were going to take my son," she said, "to protect him." "From me?" "From the world that was closing in on him because of who his father is." His voice cracked on the last word. Just slightly, just enough. "I know what it looks like. I know I don't have the right to—" "No," she said. "You don't." He didn't argue with that. She stood with her back against the kitchen counter in a safe house that belonged to a man who had, in the same 24 hours, kept her from burning and filed legal documents to take her child. And she breathed through the specific kind of fury that was cold rather than hot, that didn't need to shout because it knew exactly what it was and what it meant. Then she heard it. From the main room, Crane's voice, low and fast, one word, "Contact." And then a sound that she didn't immediately identify because it wasn't a sound she'd encountered before, a specific percussive thump from somewhere in the building, below them. And Crane was in the kitchen doorway already with the laptop gone, and something in his right hand instead and his eyes very focused. "2 teams, Crane said. "Parking structure and fire stairs. Someone gave them the address." Adrian was on his feet. "Noah," Evelyn said. She was already moving. The bedroom door opened as she reached it, and Noah stood in the doorway in his socks and the t-shirt he'd slept in, wide awake, his gray eyes moving between the adults in the hallway with the calm of a child who had spent his whole life reading rooms and knew when the room had become something serious. "Mom," he said, that same anchoring word. She put herself between him and the hallway and looked back at Adrian, and in that moment, in the specific arrangement of the 3 of them in a hallway that smelled like paint and recycled air with whatever Caldwell had sent for them already in the stairwell below, the custody document and the burning shop and 8 years of accumulated damage became temporarily irrelevant in the way that only immediate danger could make everything temporarily irrelevant. "Tell me you have a way out of this building," she said. Adrian looked at her, then at Noah, then back at her with something in his face that was the closest thing to a promise she'd seen on him yet. "3rd bedroom," he said. "There's a panel behind the closet. It goes to the service tunnel under the building. Comes out on the next block." He looked at Crane. "Take them. You'll what?" Evelyn said. "I'll give them something else to focus on." "That is the worst plan I've ever heard." "I'm open to alternatives." She looked at him. Downstairs the sound came again, closer now, and Crane had moved to cover the hallway entrance and Noah had taken a step back into the bedroom without being told, reading the geometry of the situation with those gray eyes that she had spent 7 years trying not to think about the origin of. "We all go," she said. "Together. Right now." Adrian looked at her for one more second. That look, the one that had rearranged things when he'd walked into the shop, the one that was doing it again in worse circumstances, at a worse time, with significantly higher stakes. And then he moved. "Crane," he said. "Already on it," Crane said. And as they moved toward the third bedroom and whatever was behind the closet wall, Evelyn's mind snagged on one thing and wouldn't let go of it. Not Caldwell, not the filing, not the fire, but the list of 41 names and the dates beside them, and the specific date beside the third name on the list, which she had recognized because it was a date she knew, 8 years ago, 2 weeks after she'd woken up in Providence. The name beside that date was a man called Thomas Harper, her father's name. Her father, who had died of a reported heart attack 2 weeks after she'd disappeared, whose death she had grieved alone in a motel room in Providence with no money and no way home, whose absence had been the final seal on the door she'd closed on her old life, whose death, according to Caldwell's own documentation, had been arranged. She didn't say it out loud. She filed it in the place where she was keeping everything that was too large for right now, and she took Noah's hand and she walked into the dark behind the closet wall, and she thought, Richard Caldwell is going to answer for every single name on that. They drove for 2 hours before Crane stopped. For a sheet. The safe house was in a town north of the city that had no reason to be notable, the kind of place that existed in the specific New England way of existing, quietly and without ambition. A gas station and a diner and a post office and houses set back from the road behind trees that had been there longer than anyone currently living. The house itself was a Cape style, with a detached garage and a long gravel driveway, and nothing around it for a quarter mile in any direction. Crane had the key. He always had the key. Noah woke up when the car stopped and looked around at the dark and the trees and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. Evelyn got him inside and into a bed that was plain and clean and smelled like cedar, and she sat on the edge of it until his breathing evened out, which took less time than she expected because his body was making decisions for him now, the way bodies did when they'd had enough. She came back downstairs to find Adrian at the kitchen table with the financial documents she'd taken from the safe house spread in front of him, and Crane on the phone in the corner, speaking quietly in a language she didn't immediately identify. Adrian looked up when she came in. He's asleep? Yes? Good. She sat down across from him. Not because she'd forgiven him the custody filing, she hadn't and wasn't going to process it tonight, was keeping it in the locked room with her father's name on the list and the burning shop and everything else that needed more space than she currently had. She sat down because they had work to do, and she was, it turned out, someone who did the work. Walk me through what you have, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not relief exactly. More like the recalibration of a man who'd expected a different conversation and was adjusting. The financial documents show 16 years of parallel transfers, he said. The accounts they feed into are layered, 4 shells deep, minimum. But the pattern is identifiable if you know what you're looking at. He turned one page toward her. This cluster here, these are payments to judges. 7 jurisdictions, family court, probate, federal. He's been buying procedural outcomes for a decade and a half. Including the Cayman filing. Including that, yes. He held her gaze. Evelyn, keep going, she said. He kept going. The Markov network transfers, these 3 columns, show money moving through my consolidation deals into a holding structure I never had visibility on. He was skimming the top of every negotiation I conducted. Not enough to be visible in any single transaction. Across 8 years and 40-plus deals, it's approximately $63 million that he built separately, that you didn't know about, that I didn't know about. The way he said it told her exactly what that cost him. Not the money, the not knowing. The 8 years of believing he was building something and building it for someone else's architecture the whole time. The names, she said, the 41. What do you need to make those stick, legally? He was quiet for a moment. Corroborating documentation for each. The financial records establish motive and method for some of them. The ones where the deaths benefited Caldwell's position directly. For others, we'd need witnesses, she said. Witnesses who are currently alive and have reason to talk. Reyes. Reyes will talk. He's past the point of alternatives. Adrian looked at the table. But Reyes is one voice, and the people who would need to hear this, federal-level organized crime task force, they've been trying to build a case against my organization for 6 years. Walking in with documents and a witness is not the same as walking in clean. What does walking in clean look like? He looked at her steadily. It looks like me surrendering every asset, every network, every piece of operational intelligence I have, in exchange for immunity for structured cooperation. Full disclosure. He paused. It's the kind of deal that ends careers, mine specifically. You'd be done. Completely. She looked at him. You'd lose everything you built. Everything I built was built on a lie Caldwell constructed. I've been maintaining it for 8 years on the assumption that I'd find a way to dismantle it from the inside when I was ready. He picked up the pen on the table, looked at it, set it down. I wasn't ready. I kept not being ready. And now your father is on that list, and your shop is ash, and my son is asleep upstairs in a house I hope Caldwell doesn't know about, and I'm done not being ready. She was quiet for a long time. There's a federal agent, she said finally. Her name is Souza, Diane Souza. She came to the shop about 8 months ago. Said she was following a lead on the building's ownership. She left a card. Evelyn looked at the table. I kept it. I don't know why I kept it. I never intended to call it. Where is it? Memorized, she said. I burned the card. Old habit. Something that might have been the start of a smile crossed his face very briefly and was gone. Call her. In the morning. In the morning, he agreed. Crane finished his call and came to the table. Markov's inner circle is moving. 3 of the senior lieutenants have been contacted in the last 2 hours. Someone's consolidating loyalty ahead of a transition announcement. He looked at Adrian. Caldwell's positioning to announce succession. He's going to name himself acting administrator of the Knox Holdings pending establishment of the heir's legal guardianship. Timeline, Adrian said. 48 hours. Maybe less. Adrian stood up. He'd been still for too long, and the stillness had clearly reached its limit. He moved to the window and looked out at the dark driveway, the trees, the nothing. He needs the legal filing to move before he makes the announcement. If the Cayman filing is challenged, if there's a counterfiling in a jurisdiction he doesn't own, it stalls the whole mechanism. Can you file a counter? Evelyn asked. Not fast enough. Not through normal channels. He turned from the window. But if Souza's office moves tonight, if we give them enough to open a formal investigation and freeze Caldwell's legal instruments as part of a federal inquiry, the filing dies in procedural hold. That requires calling her tonight, Evelyn said. Yes. She pulled the number out of her memory the way she pulled everything she'd decided to keep. Cleanly, completely, the whole string of digits assembled in order. She dialed on the kitchen landline because Adrian said the landline was clean, and she didn't have a reason yet to not believe him about that. It rang 4 times. Then, Souza. The voice was awake, fully awake, at 2:40 in the morning, which meant either insomnia or she'd been expecting something. This is Evelyn Harper, Evelyn said. You came to my shop on the harbor 8 months ago. You left a card. A pause. Short. I remember. I have financial documentation covering 16 years of money movement through the Knox organization's accounts into parallel structures controlled by Richard Caldwell. I have a witness. I have documentation of 41 deaths I can connect to Caldwell's operational decisions. She kept her voice level. I also have Adrian Knox, who is prepared to provide full cooperation in exchange for structured immunity. A longer pause. Where are you? Souza said. Sousa came with 2 others she introduced only by last name, Vetter and Park, and they arrived at 5:40 in the morning in a car that was aggressively ordinary and set up at the kitchen table with the documents for 90 minutes while Evelyn made coffee and Adrian talked and Crane sat against the wall and said nothing unless directly asked, which was once. Noah came downstairs at 7 and assessed the situation with his customary thoroughness, accepted the explanation that these were people helping to sort out a complicated problem, ate cereal, and went back upstairs with a book. Sousa watched him go and said nothing, but something in her expression had rearranged itself by the time she looked back at the documents. By 9, Sousa had made 4 calls from a secured line and had a federal freeze order initiated on Caldwell's legal instruments in 3 jurisdictions, including the Cayman filing. By 10, she had a warrant in process. By 10:30, she looked across the kitchen table at Adrian Knox and said, This is either the most complete cooperative package I've ever received or the most elaborate misdirection in the history of this office. I'm treating it as the former until something tells me otherwise. Nothing will tell you otherwise, Adrian said. If it does, the immunity agreement evaporates and you go away for a very long time. Understood. She looked at Evelyn. The documentation on the 41, you took this from Reyes directly? Adrian took it from Reyes. I took it from the safe house before we moved. You preserve chain of custody by keeping it on your person continuously? Yes. Sousa looked at her for a moment with the specific look of someone recalibrating an assessment. You ever consider a different career, Mrs. Harper? I like flowers, Evelyn said. The call came at noon, Caldwell himself. To Adrian's phone, which meant Caldwell either didn't know how exposed he was yet or knew exactly and had decided it didn't matter. Adrian answered it on speaker, Sousa beside him with recording equipment already running. You've been busy, Caldwell said. His voice was exactly what Evelyn had expected from a man who'd operated in the background for 30 years. Patient, measured, the voice of someone who had never needed to raise it because the architecture around him always did the work. Richard, Adrian said, the federal freeze is an interesting move. Clumsy, but interesting. You understand it doesn't actually stop anything. It delays paperwork. The loyalty transfers are already in motion. Those aren't legal instruments. They're relationships. You can't freeze a relationship. I'm not trying to freeze it, Adrian said. I'm trying to burn it. A pause. You don't have enough. I have $63 million in documented parallel transfers, 16 years of judicial corruption, and 41 names. The pause this time was different, textured, the pause of a man recalculating. Where did you get the 41? Caldwell said. Not a question. Almost quiet. Reyes. Reyes is a frightened man making poor decisions. Reyes is a federal witness making excellent ones. Adrian looked at the table. You killed Thomas Harper, Richard, her father, 2 weeks after you had her moved. Nothing from the other end for a long moment. He was getting close to understanding what I'd done, Caldwell said finally. It was necessary. The words landed in the room like something physical. Evelyn's hands were flat on the counter behind her. She didn't move. She didn't trust herself to move. Richard. Adrian's voice had gone to its lowest register, the one that didn't fluctuate. This ends today. Does it? And something shifted in Caldwell's voice, the patience thinning slightly, the first real edge beneath it. You've made a decision to burn everything you built, Adrian. 30 years of work, every alliance, every asset, every man who ever trusted the Knox name. You're going to hand all of it to a federal agent and walk away with nothing. That's right. For her. For my son, Adrian said. For the 41. For the 8 years. A pause. And yes, for her. A long silence. I'll be at the shipyard, Caldwell said. Harlow Point, the old Mercer facility. You know the one. Another pause. Come alone. Bring the documents. We can still resolve this between us. I'm not coming alone. Then bring your federal agent. Bring whoever you like. The patience was back, resettled, and that was somehow worse than the edge. But bring the boy, Adrian. Bring Noah. Because if I don't see the boy in person, the 3 men I have at that Cape House by the highway are going to make decisions I'd rather not delegate. The kitchen went absolutely silent. Sousa was already writing something. Vetter and Park were moving. Adrian's hand on the phone had gone white at the knuckles. If you touch him, Adrian started. Harlow Point, Caldwell said. 2 o'clock. Don't be late. The call ended. For 3 seconds, no one moved. Then Evelyn pushed off the counter. He's bluffing. Maybe, Crane said from the wall. Is he? She looked at Adrian. Adrian looked at Sousa. Can you get people to that Cape House in 40 minutes? I can try. Try faster than that. Sousa was already on the phone. Adrian looked at Evelyn. The thing in his face was not controlled anymore. The composure that had held through the safe house and the tunnel and the 2 hours of documentation and Caldwell's patient voice on the phone had finally reached the thing underneath it. And the thing underneath it was a man who had been cold and careful and strategic for 8 years and was now looking at the possibility that his son was in a house with 3 men Caldwell had sent. and the coldness was gone. "I need to go there," he said. It was barely above a whisper. "I know," she said. "Evelyn, I know." She held his gaze. "But you're not going alone, and you're not going without a plan, so take 30 seconds and make one." He looked at her. 30 seconds. He took them, visibly, standing in that kitchen with the weight of everything pressing down on all sides, and his jaw set and his eyes doing the thing they did when he was running calculations she couldn't see. Then, "Crane, get the car. Sousa. We need your people at Harlow Point no later than 1:45, positioned outside, not visible. Caldwell will have eyes on the approach." He looked at Evelyn. "You stay here with—" "Noah isn't here," she said. He stopped. "Noah isn't here," she said again, because she needed him to understand it fully. "He's been upstairs for 2 hours and 20 minutes. I checked on him at 10. I checked again at 11:30. She kept her voice flat because that was the only way to say it without the bottom dropping out. "He was in his room at 11:30. Sousa's people confirmed the Cape House is clean. No one touched it. No one was there." She looked at the ceiling, looked back. "He's in this house. He's here somewhere." Crane was already moving, up the stairs, and they heard him go room to room, and the sound of the small house being searched with the systematic efficiency of a man who did not do things slowly, and Evelyn stood in the kitchen with her heart doing something she could feel in her back teeth, and Adrian standing very still beside her like stillness was the only remaining form of control he had access to. Crane came back down. He stood at the bottom of the stairs. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Evelyn was up the stairs before she'd registered moving into Noah's room, the room with the cedar smell and the plain bed and the window that looked out onto the side yard and the tree line beyond, the window that was open 3 inches, the window that had a screen that was no longer in the frame, the window below which the gravel of the side yard showed the small compressed marks of sneakers that had landed and then moved toward the tree line. His chapter book was on the bed, page face down where he'd stopped. On the pillow, a rock, small, gray, smooth, the kind you found on a harbor beach when you were a kid who collected them. Evelyn picked it up. Her hands were completely steady, which was the most frightening thing she'd noticed about herself in a day full of frightening things. She came back downstairs. Adrian looked at the rock in her hand, and his face did something she had no word for. "He went on his own," she said. "He heard enough. He went on his own to—" She stopped. To do what exactly did a 7-year-old decide to do when he'd overheard 2 hours of adults deciding the shape of his life without asking him? She pressed the rock against her palm. "He's going to Harlow Point." "He doesn't know where Harlow Point is," Crane said. "He heard the address," Evelyn said. "He's been listening to everything, all night. He's 7 and he listens to everything, and he heard Caldwell say Harlow Point, and he decided—" She stopped again, breathed. He decided he wasn't going to be the thing people moved around aboard anymore. Adrian looked at the rock, at the open window, at Evelyn. "He's my son," he said. And the way he said it, not possessive, not declarative, just true and devastating, and said with the full weight of a man who'd missed 7 years of exactly this kind of thing and was feeling all 7 of those years simultaneously, made Evelyn press the rock harder into her palm until she could feel the edge of it. "Then let's go get him," she said. Sousa was on the radio already. The warrant was in motion. The freeze orders were in place. Vetter and Park were coordinating approach routes to a waterfront shipyard that had been dark for 11 years and was, as of approximately 90 seconds ago, the most important location on the eastern seaboard. Evelyn walked to the car. She still had the folded documents inside her jacket. She still had 41 names behind her eyes. She still had a rock in her left hand that her son had left on a pillow as the only note he knew how to leave, and she was not going to put it down. The harbor was 20 minutes from here. Harlow Point was at the far end of the waterfront, past the fishing boats and the restaurants, and the place where her shop had stood before last night made it something else. Richard Caldwell was there. Her son was going there. And Evelyn Harper, who had rebuilt her entire life on the principle that she could survive anything as long as she stayed small and stayed quiet and kept her head down and asked nothing of anyone, was done with every single part of that. She got in the car. Adrian got in beside her. Crane had the engine running before the door closed. Sousa's vehicle pulled out ahead of them, and they followed it down the gravel driveway and onto the road, and Evelyn watched the tree line move past the window and thought about a 7-year-old boy walking towards something he didn't fully understand because he'd decided, in the particular logic of a child who had spent his whole life reading rooms, that waiting for adults to solve it was not a viable strategy. He got that from her. She knew exactly where he got that from. "How does he think he's getting there?" Crane said, not to anyone specifically. "There's a bus stop," Evelyn said. "Half-mile down the main road. She stopped. He'd had his jacket on the chair downstairs. She'd seen it when she came down this morning and registered it without noting it, and now she noted it. He took his jacket. He had $6 in the pocket. He told me last week he had $6 saved." Adrian was looking straight ahead through the windshield. "He's been planning this." "No, he heard Caldwell and he decided. He's fast." She looked at the road. "He's very fast." Nobody said anything for a moment. "He's going to be all right," Adrian said. Not reassurance, statement of intent. "I know," she said. Same register, same intent. They hit the highway, and Crane pushed the car to what it could do, and the miles came off in the gray October morning, the harbor appearing ahead of them as they came over the rise south of the city. That flat gray water, the boats, the light doing what it always did, indifferent and silver and the same as it had been every morning for 8 years when she'd unloaded flowers in the dark and told herself tomorrow would be better. Tomorrow was today. It just looked different than she'd planned. Sousa's radio crackled. Vetter's voice. "We have a visual on a juvenile on foot, Harbor Road approaching Harlow Point Gate. Kids alone, moving fast." Evelyn closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. "Don't approach him," Adrian said into Sousa's radio before Sousa could respond. "Don't spook him. Just keep eyes on." "Copy," Vetter said. Evelyn opened her eyes. The water was close now. She could smell it through the car's ventilation, salt and cold, and the particular harbor smell that had been the backdrop of 8 years of survival and was about to be the backdrop of something else entirely. "When this is over," Adrian said quietly, not looking at her, "I'm withdrawing the filing." She didn't answer immediately. "I know," she said finally. The shipyard appeared at the end of Harbor Road, its rusted gates and dark warehouses sitting against the water like something the city had forgotten on purpose. And somewhere inside it, Richard Caldwell was waiting with 30 years of careful architecture and the absolute certainty that he had already won. He hadn't met Noah yet. He hadn't met either of them, not really, not the versions that existed right now, forged out of 8 years of separate damage and 24 hours of burning everything down to what was actually true. Crane stopped the car at the gate. Adrian looked at Evelyn. She looked at him. They got out. The gate was unlocked. That was the first thing. The rusted chain that should have secured the Mercer facility's main entrance had been cut recently. The metal bright at the break, catching the gray morning light in a way that old rust didn't. Caldwell had wanted them to come in easily. Easy entry was its own kind of message. "I'm not afraid of you arriving. I'm counting on it." Crane saw it the same time Adrian did. Neither of them said anything. Sousa's people were fanning out along the perimeter fence on the north and south approaches, moving in the low, careful way of people who had done this kind of thing enough times that the carefulness was muscular rather than deliberate. Vetter had eyes on Noah. Last report, the boy had slipped through a gap in the fence on the eastern side, which meant he was already inside, which meant every calculation about approach and timing had to account for a 7-year-old moving through 11 years of abandoned industrial infrastructure on his own initiative. Evelyn pushed the gate open and walked through first. Adrian was a half step behind her. She felt him there without looking. The specific gravity of a large man moving carefully, the almost soundlessness of it, the way his presence rearranged the air. The Mercer facility had been a shipping operation in another era. Loading bays, warehousing, a dry dock that no longer held water, a network of interconnected structures that ran from the gate to the harbor's edge about 300 yards away. In its working life, it had processed cargo through the night with floodlights running and machinery loud enough to feel in your chest. Now it was dark and salt-eaten, and the November wind came off the water through the broken windows in the warehouse, faces and moved things. Loose sheeting, old rope, the skeletal remains of rigging that nobody had bothered to clear. It was the kind of place that had absorbed a lot of history and kept none of it clean. Evelyn scanned the space ahead, the open ground between the gate and the first warehouse, the shadows in the loading bay doorways, the catwalks above. Her eyes had adjusted to the flat gray light. She was looking for Noah before she was looking for anything else, and she knew that and didn't try to correct it. Movement. Left side, upper level of the second warehouse, a catwalk, and on it a small figure moving parallel to them, tracking their entry from above. She touched Adrian's arm. He'd already seen it. Noah was shadowing them. He'd gotten inside, found high ground, and positioned himself to observe. 7 years old, in a derelict waterfront shipyard, running his own surveillance operation because he'd decided that was the logical thing to do. She was going to have a very long conversation with him about this. Later. "He's all right," Adrian said, very quiet. "I know," she said. Same volume. They kept moving. Dr. King. Caldwell was in the dry dock. He was standing at the near end of it, where the dock floor met the main yard, with the harbor behind him and the open sky above, and the cold water smell coming up from the empty basin at his back. He was wearing a gray overcoat that fit him well, and his silver hair was neat, and he looked, Evelyn thought, exactly like what he was. A man who had spent 30 years ensuring that he was always the most composed person in any given situation. He had 2 men with him. They were positioned slightly behind and to either side, the professional arrangement of men who were there to enforce rather than participate. He looked at Evelyn first, then at Adrian, then, briefly, up toward the catwalk where Noah had been, which told her he'd known the boy was here before they arrived. "You made good time," Caldwell said. "Where are your men at the Cape House?" Adrian said. "There are no men at the Cape House." Caldwell said it without particular emphasis. "There never were. I needed you to move quickly, and I needed the boy here. Both accomplished." He looked at Evelyn. "He's very resourceful, your son. He came through the east fence gap. I had someone watching it. They let him through." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "You used him to get us here faster." "I used the fact that he was listening and that he would act on what he heard, which is, I'll grant you, more my doing than yours. I underestimated how much he'd absorbed." Caldwell tilted his head slightly. "He has Adrian's instincts. That's not a small thing." "Stop talking about my son," Evelyn said. Caldwell looked at her for a moment. The patient expression didn't change. "Miss Harper, I want you to understand that nothing I've done has been personal. Your father, don't. Your father was a man who was going to make a great deal of noise at a moment when noise was expensive. I made a difficult decision based on operational necessity. I've made 41 such decisions. I don't enjoy them." "You keep a list," Evelyn said. "People who enjoyed it didn't keep lists." Something moved in Caldwell's expression. Not guilt. She didn't think this man had guilt in the conventional sense, more like the involuntary acknowledgement of an accurate observation. "The documents you have," he said, shifting to Adrian, "are incomplete. You have the transfers, the names, the judicial records. You don't have the corresponding authorization structures, the sign-offs that would show, in any rigorous legal examination, that every major decision was made with Knox organization approval. Your approval, Adrian, your signature, your verbal authorization, documented by witnesses I retained for exactly this purpose." The dry dock went very quiet. "You built a parallel record," Adrian said. "I built a complete record, one in which you are the architect of everything and I am the administrator executing your instructions." Caldwell clasped his hands in front of him, the gesture of a man settling into a prepared position. "The documents Ms. Harper is carrying establish my financial activity. My parallel record establishes your criminal liability for all of it. Whichever version federal investigators receive first defines the narrative." Adrian said nothing. "The immunity agreement you're attempting to structure with Agent Souza," Caldwell continued, "requires you to be a cooperative witness rather than a primary subject. My record makes you the primary subject. The moment it's submitted, which happens automatically if I fail to make a specific call within," he glanced at his watch, "40 minutes, The immunity agreement becomes legally impossible. You become the target. The boy's custody reverts to the Cayman filing, which, despite your freeze order, has a secondary activation clause that Sousa's office doesn't know about yet. He said it all in the same patient, measured voice. The voice of a man reading a prepared statement, which was exactly what it was. 30 years of preparation distilled into 4 minutes of delivery in a dry dock on a November morning. Evelyn looked at Adrian. Adrian was looking at Caldwell with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet. Not the controlled composure, not the thing underneath it. Something older than both. Something that had been waiting in him since the night he'd believed she'd chosen another life and decided to become the kind of man that choice had made. "Richard," he said. "Adrian, you built all of this because you believed I would never burn it down." "You built an empire," Caldwell said. "Men who build empires don't burn them." "I didn't build it for the empire." Adrian looked at the gray water in the harbor behind Caldwell, the flat November light on it. "I built it because I didn't have anything else. That's not the same thing. And you knew that, and you used it, and you kept using it for 8 years because you thought the not having anything else was permanent. Isn't it?" Adrian looked at Evelyn. He looked at the catwalk above, where Noah had been and was no longer. Where Noah had been and was now, she realized when she tracked the movement, on the ground level, inside the loading bay to their left, having descended by some route she hadn't tracked, standing in the shadow of the bay doorway with his jacket zipped and his arms at his sides, and his gray eyes on the scene in the dry dock with an expression of absolute focused attention. "No," Adrian said. "It's not." He reached into his jacket. Not for a weapon. Caldwell's men had tensed, and he let them see his hand come out empty except for a phone. He held it up. "The parallel record," Adrian said. "The authorization structures, the signed documents, and the witness statements. They're in a server farm in Zurich, under a partition you set up 18 months ago when you started building the case against me." He watched Caldwell's face. The access credentials for that partition were in Reyes's folder. He'd pulled them 6 months ago for his own insurance. He gave them to me last night. Caldwell was very still. "Crane spent this morning working with Sousa's technical unit," Adrian said. "The parallel record was accessed at 6:47 a.m. and copied in full. Sousa's office has your version and the original simultaneously. The first submission advantage you were counting on doesn't exist." He lowered the phone. "And the secondary activation clause in the Cayman filing, the one Sousa's office doesn't know about, you just told us it exists and how it triggers. She's been listening to this conversation for 12 minutes. He touched his collar. A small device, matte black, the size of a shirt button. Sousa's voice came through it, flat and clear. "Mr. Caldwell, I'd like you to keep your hands visible." The two men behind Caldwell looked at each other. It was a small look, brief, the kind of recalculation that happened when the leverage shifted without warning. The one on the left stepped back. Not dramatically, just the single step of a man who had decided that the thing he was being paid to enforce was no longer worth enforcing. The one on the right held for 3 more seconds. Then he did the same. Caldwell stood alone in the dry dock. He looked at Adrian. The patience was still there in his face, but it was load-bearing now, holding something up that wanted to collapse. 30 years, he said. "I know," Adrian said. "I built everything you used, every alliance, every network, every relationship that made the Knox name mean something in every room that mattered. You did. And you're going to hand it to a federal agent and walk away." "Yes." Caldwell looked at Evelyn. The look was long and assessing, and she held it without moving, the rock from Noah's pillow still in her jacket pocket, her hand not on it, but aware of it. "Your father," Caldwell said. "For what it's worth nothing," she said. "Don't." He stopped. From the loading bay doorway, Noah took 1 step forward into the light. Just 1 step, enough to be visible, enough to be counted. He looked at Caldwell with the gray eyes and said nothing, and Caldwell looked back at him. And whatever Caldwell saw there, the combination of Adrian's directness and Evelyn's stubbornness, and 7 years of a child who'd learned to read every room he'd ever been in, made the patience in his face finally, quietly, give way. Not to guilt, not to regret, just to age. He looked for the first time like a man at the end of something. Sousa came through the loading bay entrance with Veteran Park, and two additional agents Evelyn hadn't seen before, and Caldwell put his hands up without being asked, and it was the most orderly thing that had happened in the last 24 hours. Noah sat on a concrete barrier at the edge of the yard while the federal agents worked the scene, and Evelyn sat beside him, and for a while neither of them said anything. The harbor moved behind the dry dock. Fishing boats were coming in on the late morning tide. The light had shifted from gray to something closer to white. "You scared me," she said finally. "I know." He was looking at the harbor. "I'm sorry. Are you—" A pause. "Kind of." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the gray eyes and the stubborn jaw and the complete absence of performance that had always been the most disarming thing about him. "He was going to use me," Noah said, "to get what he wanted. I heard him say it. I didn't want to be the thing he was moving around." "I know. So I moved myself." She looked at her hands. She thought about 8 years of moving herself. The Providence Motel, the harbor neighborhood, the before dawn unloading, the careful mathematics of survival, the apple and the tree, and the distance between them that turned out to be no distance at all. "Next time," she said, "you tell me first." "What if there's no time?" "Then you find time. You make 30 seconds and you tell me." She looked at him. "We're not doing this alone anymore, either of us. That's the new rule." Noah considered this with the seriousness he brought to rules he was actually going to follow. "Okay," he said. Adrian came across the yard toward them. He moved differently than he had yesterday. Something in the set of his shoulders, some weight that had been distributed differently now, not gone, but redistributed into something he was carrying openly rather than armored around. He stopped a few feet away and looked at Noah. "You came through the east fence gap," Adrian said. "It was the only one that wasn't watched," Noah said. "The catwalk. How'd you find the access stairs?" "I looked for where the rust was worn. People step in the same places." Adrian was quiet for a moment. Yeah, that's right." He looked at the ground briefly, then back at the boy. "That was also an extremely dangerous thing to do, and you should not have done it." "I know," Noah said. "Do you?" "Yes. But I also knew you were coming, and I knew the federal agents were coming, and I wanted him to see me." Noah looked toward the dock where Caldwell was being processed. "I wanted him to see that I wasn't scared of him." "Were you scared?" A pause. Honest, which was the only kind Noah had. "Yes." "Good," Adrian said. "The ones who say they're not scared are the ones who get hurt." He crouched down to Noah's level, which put them eye to eye, the same gray, the same directness, the same quality of absolute attention. "I have something to tell you. It's a large thing, and you can ask me anything about it, and I'll answer." Noah looked at him. "Okay. I'm your father." The harbor moved, the boats came in. The white November light sat on everything evenly, without preference. Noah looked at Adrian for a long time, then he looked at Evelyn. She held his gaze and didn't fill the silence, because it wasn't her silence to fill. "I know," Noah said. Adrian looked at him. "I've known since yesterday," Noah said. "The eyes. And the way you looked at me." He considered. "And you paid for our flowers for 8 years. Mom told me about the Tuesday envelopes when I was 5. Someone who pays for your flowers for 8 years isn't a stranger." Evelyn felt something move through her chest that she didn't try to name. Adrian sat down on the concrete barrier on the other side of Noah. The three of them sat in a row looking at the harbor, and for a while the only sounds were the water and the boats, and the distant professional voices of federal agents doing the work of dismantling 30 years of architecture that had been built on a lie. "The shop's gone," Noah said eventually. "Yes," Evelyn said. "Will you build another one?" She looked at the harbor. At the waterfront, the neighborhood she'd spent 8 years in, the place that had been the backdrop of everything. The survival and the silence, and the Tuesday envelopes and the before dawn work, and the careful small life she'd constructed on the assumption that small was safe. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think you should," Noah said. "You're good at it." The federal case took 11 months to build and 6 weeks to try. Evelyn was in the courtroom for every day of it. She sat in the third row with a yellow legal pad and took notes she didn't need. The prosecutors were thorough and prepared, and Sousa's team had done the kind of work that didn't leave gaps. But the act of writing kept her hands busy and her presence visible, which mattered to her in a way she didn't fully articulate to anyone. She was called to testify on the 14th day. She sat in the witness chair and answered questions for 4 hours in the flat. Careful voice she'd developed over 8 years of managing situations that required her to be composed, and she was composed. And when the defense attorney asked whether she had any personal animus toward Richard Caldwell, she said, "My father is on the list of 41. I have significant personal animus. I'm here anyway because the truth doesn't require my feelings to be small." And the courtroom was quiet for a moment after that, and the way rooms went quiet when something accurate was said plainly. Richard Caldwell was convicted on 37 counts. The remaining 4 involved evidentiary complexities that the prosecutors had flagged in advance and that resulted in hung jury decisions, which meant 3 men from the list of 41 didn't get the specific legal verdict their families might have wanted. Evelyn thought about those 3 men and their families, and she thought about imperfect outcomes and the difference between justice and completion, and she decided that 37 was not nothing. 37 was the work of the documents she'd kept in her jacket through a tunnel and a car ride and a waterfront confrontation, and she was going to count it. Caldwell received 4 consecutive life sentences. He sat through the sentencing with the patient expression he'd brought to everything, and Evelyn watched him from the third row and waited for something to shift in her. The release, the exhale, the thing people described when the verdict came down on the person who'd taken something from them. It came, but it was quieter than she'd expected, less like a door opening and more like a window, finally, cracked. She went home and called her mother's old friend in Gloucester, the woman who'd known Thomas Harper before Evelyn was born, and she talked for 2 hours about what kind of man he'd been, and she cried, for the first time, for the right reasons. Adrian's cooperation agreement took longer to finalize than the criminal case. The asset surrender was complex: 37 jurisdictions, 11 years of consolidated holdings, relationships and networks that required careful unwinding rather than simple seizure. He worked with Sousa's team for 8 months, providing testimony, documentation, and the kind of detailed operational intelligence that had 3 separate federal task forces restructuring their understanding of organized crime on the eastern seaboard. He was not free of consequence. The immunity agreement covered his criminal exposure, not his reputation or his finances, the vast majority of which were forfeit as proceeds of criminal enterprise. He ended the process with what he'd started with, before the empire: a name, a facility for making people trust him, and a very specific set of skills that had almost no legitimate application. He told Evelyn this in her kitchen. She had a kitchen again, a small apartment 2 blocks from the harbor, close enough to smell the water in the morning. On a Tuesday night in March, 8 months after the trial, sitting at her table with coffee going cold the way coffee always went cold when there was something real being said. "So what do you do now?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said. She looked at him. The severity was still there. The years had built it into the structure of his face, and it wasn't coming out. But something else had grown alongside it in the last 11 months. Something quieter. The specific quality of a man who had stopped performing certainty because he no longer needed it to hold things together. "There's a building," she said, "on the harbor, 3 blocks from where the shop was. Ground floor commercial space, 2 floors of residential above. The owner wants to sell, not lease." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "It's more than I can buy." He looked at her. "It's a conversation," she said. "Not a decision, not yet." "Okay," he said. "I'm good at conversations." "Since when?" "Since roughly 4 months ago. I've been working on it." She looked at him for a moment, and what she felt was not the thing she'd felt when he'd walked into the shop in October, not the floor shifting, not the old frequency, not the scramble of recognition and history and unprocessed damage. What she felt was simpler and more durable, the specific weight of a person sitting across a table from you who had seen the worst of what you'd built and chosen to stay in the room. That was not a small thing. She knew, better than most, how rarely it happened. "Noah has a school concert next Thursday," she said. "He's playing the recorder. He's terrible at it. You should come." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "I'd like that." He'll want you to sit in the front row. He likes an audience. He gets that from you. He gets it from both of us, she said. That's the part you're going to have to get used to. When he does something impossible, it comes from both of us. Spring came to the harbor the way it always did. Gradually and then suddenly, the way the good things came, without announcement. The building on Harbor Road took 4 months to negotiate and another 3 to renovate, which meant the flower shop opened in July, which was not the ideal month for a flower shop opening because July was loud and crowded and the harbor smelled like sunscreen and boat fuel rather than salt and cold. Evelyn opened it anyway because she was done waiting for Ideal. The sign above the door was new. She'd painted it herself on a Saturday in June, with Noah on a stepladder beside her offering opinions on the letter spacing that were specific and mostly wrong, and that she incorporated anyway because he was 7. 8 now, he'd had a birthday in May, and his opinions about letter spacing were as good as anyone else's until proven otherwise. No name. She'd decided against a name again. The neighborhood would call it what they called it. The first Tuesday after opening, she came downstairs at 6 to start the cases and found an envelope on the counter. She stood very still for a moment. Then she opened it. Inside, cash, the exact amount for the standing order, a generous tip. And the card, in the handwriting she'd memorized without meaning to, except it wasn't cramped anymore. It was the same handwriting opened up slightly, like a man who'd stopped writing small because he was no longer trying to take up less space. White lilies? Blue hydrangeas. Fresh as you have them. And below it, for the first time in 8 years, Adrian. She put the card with the others, not in a shoebox this time. She'd found a small frame at the second-hand place on the next block, and she put the card in it, and she hung it on the wall behind the counter where the light caught it in the mornings. Noah came down at 7:15 with his hair going 4 directions. He looked at the envelope on the counter, and then at the framed card on the wall, and then at his mother. He signed it this time, he said. He did. Noah considered this while he tied his shoe in the lopsided way she'd never corrected. That's better, he said. Yes, she said. It is. Outside the harbor, morning was doing what it did. The boats, the light, the water moving the way water always moved, indifferent and silver and completely uninterested in what anyone had survived to reach it. Evelyn stood in her doorway with her coffee and looked at it, and what she felt was not triumph, and it was not relief, and it was not the specific exhausted satisfaction of someone who had outlasted the thing trying to break them, though it was some of all of those. What it was mostly was mourning, a real one, the kind you stood in without calculating what it was going to cost you. She went back inside and started cutting stems. The door opened at 8. The first customer of the day was a man buying carnations who didn't make eye contact. The second was a woman who wanted to know if they did arrangements for office lobbies, and this time, when the woman asked the price, she stayed.